Bloody night in the forest cemetery. Anna woke up from a strange noise in the kitchen. Her husband, Alexei, was standing at the table, swaying. His face was distorted with pain, and deep wounds were visible on his neck. "Don't be scared, dear," he croaked. "There's blood on my neck. I don't know what's wrong with me." Anna looked at her husband in horror. She quickly prepared water, as he asked. Alexei sank heavily into a chair, shaking. "Something rushed out of the grave at night in the forest cemetery," he said with difficulty. "It bit my neck." Anna turned pale. She knew what it meant. Many years ago, her grandmother told scary stories about vampires that lived in the old cemetery. "I brought garlic and candles, put them on the table," Alexei continued, "holy water and an aspen stake. If I turn into another, you must pierce my heart." Anna silently fulfilled his requests. She could not believe that this was happening to them. "I do not know what happened," Alexei whispered, "but it seems to me that death is ahead. After all, I was bitten by a vampire." The night dragged on endlessly. Alexei tossed and turned in delirium, and Anna prayed that the dawn would find them alive. When the first rays of the sun illuminated the room, Alexei went limp. His eyes were empty. Anna fulfilled her husband's last request. She took an aspen stake and pierced his heart. At that moment, everything ended. Since then, she never went to the old cemetery again. And in their house, an aspen stake and holy water were always kept, in case the ancient evil returned.
In 2000, a terrible story happened to me and my family. I was 10 years old then. My parents bought a 4-room apartment. Before that, we lived with my grandmother, but we always wanted to have our own living space. And when my parents saw an ad for the sale of this apartment, they immediately caught fire with this idea. The apartment was simply huge. We were all so happy that it was sold to us that we did not even look at the price, which, in comparison, as it turned out later, with other apartments in this house, was almost half as much. And then the day of moving in, we go up to the 9th floor. In front of us is a black door. On it is written 103. And so we cross the threshold of our apartment. And from that very moment, I will never forget this time. I am 10 years old. I have my own room. I am incredibly happy. New friends began to appear after the move, both me and my parents. But somehow everything did not go well with the residents of the house. There were always complaints about us. Either someone would bang on the floor, supposedly in our apartment, or screams would be heard all night long, and such screams that it would freeze your blood. The police even came to us a couple of times. But the point is that while we lived in this very apartment, nothing like that happened. At least we didn't hear it. About a month passed. Mom and Dad would fight very often. He would come home and yell for no reason. They were both on edge. Mom because of Dad, and he just for no reason. With the arrival of summer, we noticed that no matter how much we opened the windows, trying to bring more light into the apartment was still gloomy and damp, even though the sun was shining right through our window. For some unknown reason, the light simply didn't get through the glass. Mom even tried to wash them several times, but the result was the same. One day, when my father was supposed to come home in the middle of the night, a thunderstorm started. I was watching TV. I felt my mother sit down next to me from behind, hug me, and that's how we fell asleep. Later, in my sleep, I heard the front door open. My father, I thought, taking off his shoes. He went into the living room, lay down, hugging us. I calmed down and began to fall asleep. But my mother, on the contrary, shuddered slightly. And at that very moment, the sound of the door opening was heard in the hallway again. "It's me!" My father's voice was heard in the hallway. I was seized with immense horror. The light in the hallway came on, and my father appeared in the doorway. The light from the hallway blinded my eyes. "Where's my mother?" he asked. I looked back, but neither the one who came, as it turned out, before my father was there, nor was my mother, who was hugging me, either. I just started to twitch. Tears were welling up in my eyes. My father came into the living room, turned on the light, hugged me. I swore to him that my mother had been next to me literally a minute ago. Suddenly my mother came out of the next room. "Why did you get dressed?" she asked. "Go back to bed. And you go to sleep too," she told me. When I told her everything, my mother confirmed my words, saying that my father really did come home early. But after what my father said, my dears, I was on a business trip for 3 weeks in another region. A couple of days later, we moved out of there. No one bought the apartment. We even set the price lower than what we paid, but in vain. But as it recently turned out, the house was subject to demolition. We received compensation for this apartment, which we left 12 years ago. Several human remains were found in the rubble of the demolished building, despite the fact that after the evacuation the house was checked several times.
Anarchist zombie. In a small town on the outskirts of Siberia, there lived an old magician named Grigory. He was known for his strange experiments and love of strong drinks. One night, already blind from old age, he went into the forest to get ingredients for a new potion. In the cemetery, where local drunks and rebels were once buried, Grigory accidentally spilled his experimental elixir. "What have I done, old man?" he muttered, feeling the ground with his cane. The dead began to rise from their graves. At their head walked a former local artist in his invariable leather coat. He was an anarchist in life and remained one in death. His favorite cry, "Hoy, down with the Joe," he called his subordinates. The zombies burst into the village, destroying everything in their path. They were invulnerable to conventional weapons. Axes and pitchforks did not harm them. They especially enjoyed making the locals dance to their wild cries. The dead artist had his favorite gesture frozen on his hand, a clenched fist with an extended middle finger, and a pirate flag was sticking out of his coat pocket. Anarchists are not an evil people. They screamed all night, although their actions said otherwise. The sun had burned most of the dead, but in the basement of the old tavern, the familiar cry of "Hoy" was still heard. They say that if you come to the place where the tavern stood on a full moon, you can hear the echo of this cry and see the shadows of the dancing dead, whirling in a mad dance led by their leader in a leather coat. And the old magician Grigory disappeared after that night. Some say he still wanders the forest, trying to find an antidote to his failed experiment, but now in the company of the restless souls, he himself awakened.
I heard this story from my grandmother. Here are her words. A lonely woman of about 65 to 70 lived in our village. Everyone thought she was a witch. She was unsociable, didn't communicate with anyone. Her house was at the end of the village. People tried to avoid that house, didn't want to catch the eye of this witch. I was about 15 then, and my friends and I decided to climb into her garden and steal apples. We were reluctant to believe that she was a witch. But, as they say, you won't believe it until you see it yourself. And we, naive and stupid, climbed over her fence and started picking apples and putting them in our pockets. The witch came out onto the porch and started yelling at us. We didn't understand what exactly, but we were very scared. When we had already thrown down the apples and were running back, we heard her yelling something after us. We ran to our street. None of us told our parents anything, because we knew that we would be scolded severely, because we were forbidden to approach her house. We forgot everything until the evening, continued to play. Then it began to get dark, and we all went home. I went to bed, when I felt that my hands began to swell. As it turned out later, not only my hands, but my whole body. I was seriously scared, and I was afraid to tell my parents that we had climbed into the witch's garden. Somehow I still fell asleep. In the morning I woke up because my whole body hurt and ached terribly. I tried to open my eyes, but I couldn't. My whole face was swollen, I couldn't even open my eyes. I got scared, jumped out of bed, ran to my mother in the kitchen. Mom, seeing me, almost dropped the saucepan on the floor. She began to examine me. My whole body was very swollen and ached terribly. She started asking me what I was doing on the street yesterday. And I confessed everything to her through my tears. She didn't scold me, because she was very scared herself. She asked who I went there with yesterday. I named all the kids I was with. Mom, dropping everything, ran to the parents of the children whose names I named. As it turned out, the same thing happened to all the kids as to me. Our mothers, at their own risk, decided to get together and go to that witch to apologize for us. They collected everything they could for her, some eggs, some milk, some vegetables. They came, apologized, said that the children were small, still stupid, did not understand anything. After that, the swelling began to go down for all of us, and by evening we were happily frolicking on the street again. And we were afraid to even think about that witch. They also said that that witch turned into a huge pig at night and ran around the yards. A few years later, the witch died, and the whole village breathed a sigh of relief. And her house still stands there, all rotten and slanted, a quarter of it sunk into the ground, but people still avoid it.
In 2002, a book written by an unknown writer hit the shelves. No one advertised it, but because of the intriguing title and limited number of copies, those who managed to find out about it strove to buy it as soon as possible. There was no picture on the cover, only a black inscription on a gray cover, the Book of Alien Blood. Opening the book right in the store after buying, immediately returned to the seller demanding a refund, since all the pages were blank. Some took the book home and were just as surprised and angry. In a year, only 3 copies were bought and not returned. It seems that the owners decided that the blank pages would also come in handy, or simply went somewhere, or gave the book to friends. In general, a few months later, there was another hype as the same book appeared, but with a filled-in first page. Now about 100 books have been sold, which have been attacked by lovers of oddities. On this filled page were written sentences in German. Although it was first published in Russia, all the sentences were numbered, and there were about 10 of them. Many people were then bothered by their acquaintances who were experts in the language. The title turned out to be telling, since all the numbered sentences were descriptions of all sorts of violent deaths. These were the standard: suffocation, bleeding from veins, drowning, and so on. At this point the written pages ended again, and then it was empty. Half a year later, the police were stirred up by terrible suicides. Not so terrible, but unusual and strange. A man knocked out his teeth and choked to death. A woman tried to drink her own blood, and so on. In the apartments of the deceased, a receipt from a bookstore was found, but the purchased book of Alien Blood was not found. Meanwhile, other owners of the books discovered that the pages continued to be independently supplemented with new texts. The police did not believe in mysticism and began searching for the maniac. The only clue was that only customers of the bookstore where the books were sold were dying. Having learned about this, people began to try to burn the book, but, as they say, manuscripts do not burn. The book smoked. The inscription on the cover darkened, but it was impossible to destroy it. The more often the suicides occurred, the more people tried to get rid of it. A week later, the police caught the seller who was trying to flee the country. He spent about a month in prison before his cellmates beat him to death. Meanwhile, the suicides continued and became even more sophisticated. In 2010, the book was cut. Yes, the book. After one volume was taken, all the others mysteriously disappeared. Now it was almost half full. The author of this masterpiece was never found. All the pages of the book were torn out, and since it was impossible to cut or to them, they were placed in the library, stuffed one page at a time into different editions. It seems that the sheets themselves were nothing strange, and only the indestructible texts were important. All data about it was classified, and access to that very library was restricted, so that no one would be sure to collect this book completely. The cover was placed in an iron box, which was under surveillance almost around the clock. Washington S. On April 22, 2013, the cover disappeared, as did the first 10 pages of the book, and they continue to disappear to this day. All that is known is that its last, 989th victim was a man named Sergei, whose last name was immediately classified. He pierced his throat with a switched-on drill. This fact is carefully hidden, but even the Secret Services do not know when the Book of Alien Blood will return to the shelves.
Revenge. This was the only time I ended up in the hospital and spent a week there. I ended up there under rather strange circumstances. A man died in the house where I lived with my family. His sister was collecting money from apartments for the funeral. We learned from her that he died of a heart attack at home, right in his chair. A rather strange death, considering that he lived all alone, and he never had any heart problems. Marina, the man's sister, asked me and a couple of other girls from the neighborhood to look after the apartment for the next couple of weeks. Well, we agreed. We decided to take turns on duty, twice a week, come in, water the flowers, air out the room. It was my turn. I went up to the 3rd floor, opened the door with the key I had left behind. I put it on the nightstand at the entrance. I watered the flowers, opened the window. When I finished all this, I closed the window and headed for the exit, and the keys are not on the nightstand. I decided that I forgot them somewhere in the room, although I was sure that I put them here. I come back and see this picture. The window is wide open, white curtains are fluttering in the wind, and opposite the window stands a girl. She is standing with her back to me, in a long white nightgown, with dark tangled hair, shuddering. Her hands on her wrists look like they are pinched with ropes. Hey, I was a little taken aback by this. For what? The girl sobbed and turned to me. She looked about 14 years old. She had tear-stained eyes, and on her neck there were the same marks from the ropes as on her hands. Suddenly, 2 men ran out of the next room. One ran to the exit, straight at me, and the second, after a pause, headed towards the girl. The girl screamed when he approached her. The accomplice didn't pay attention to this and ran further towards the exit, through me. I didn't even have time to scream. Everything happened so instantly. I staggered back, tripped over the threshold, fell, hit my head and passed out. I woke up in the hospital, and when I opened my eyes, I saw simply shocked doctors. It felt like they were about to bury me, and I just opened my eyes. As it turned out, I had been unconscious for 3 days. The doctors declared a coma, and the fact that I woke up was something inexplicable from their point of view. I told them what had happened. They didn't really believe me, but the girl, my neighbor in the ward, believed me. She told me something about my house. As it turned out, a wealthy family used to live in the apartment on the 3rd floor. The father had his own business. He earned well, so neither his wife nor his daughter needed anything, but his business partner considered himself very offended. He envied his friend, and one late evening, when the businessman and his wife left, he and his faithful comrade made their way into the house where a 14-year-old girl was sleeping. They broke into the safe and were about to leave, but the girl woke up. The envious man suddenly thought that he had not taken enough revenge by stealing every last penny. He pounced on the girl, tied her to the bed and raped her. After that, he strangled her as an unnecessary witness. When her father ran into the apartment with a police squad, the girl's heart had already stopped. The robber was caught. His accomplice was found only a few years later and was still acquitted. A couple of years later, the apartment was sold, and that same accomplice, whose guilt was never proven, moved in. When I was discharged from the hospital, I immediately went to that apartment. Why, just like that, I put flowers in a vase, in memory of that girl. The man must have seen the same thing I saw, and his heart couldn't take it, or maybe the girl's ghost just took revenge on him. It was stupid of him to return to the crime scene.
It's all a lie, Anna said, but her voice sounded uncertain. Suddenly they heard a sound as if someone had approached the hut. Igor and Anna froze, listening. The door slowly opened, and Maxim appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes full of terror. "She's here!" he shouted, and without waiting for an answer, he rushed inside. "Who?" Anna asked, but Maxim only pointed to the door. At that moment they heard a rustle and the shadow appeared again, this time in the doorway. It was huge and seemed alive, as if the darkness itself had taken shape. The friends retreated to the wall in horror. "We have to get out of here," Igor shouted. But when they tried to get out, the door slammed shut, and they found themselves locked in. The shadow was slowly approaching, and each of them felt fear grip their hearts. "This is the end," Anna whispered as the shadow covered them. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. The shadow stopped and seemed to dissolve. Instead of attacking, it turned into a cloud of black smoke that enveloped them but did not cause any harm. "What's going on?" Maxim asked, not believing his eyes. "I don't know," Anna answered, "but it seems it doesn't want to kill us." Suddenly, they heard a voice coming from the cloud of smoke. "You came to my forest, and now you must understand that fear is just an illusion. I'm not angry with you, but you must learn to respect this place." The friends looked at each other, not believing their ears. The shadow continued to speak, and they realized that it was not evil, but something that guarded the forest. "If you want to leave, you will need to pass a test. You must overcome your fears and show that you are worthy of leaving this forest." Gathering their courage, the friends agreed. They began to talk about their fears, about what worried them, and gradually the shadow began to disappear until only a light haze remained. When they finished, the door of the hut opened, and the forest became familiar again. They walked out onto a familiar path and finally saw the light of the moon. "We did it," Igor said, and they all hugged. But when they left the forest, each of them felt that something had changed. They became more confident in themselves, and the fear that once paralyzed them now seemed like just a shadow. From then on, they were no longer afraid of the forest. They realized that fear is not an enemy, but a part of themselves, and only by overcoming it can one become stronger. Only no one ever saw Sveta again. In a small town surrounded by dense forests, there were rumors that something sinister lived in these forests. Locals tried not to go into the forest after sunset, and those who dared often did not return. But for a group of friends, Maxim, Anna, Igor, and Sveta, these were just stories that they happily discussed around the campfire. One warm autumn evening, they decided to spend the night in the forest to check if there really was something scary in it. They packed tents, food, and flashlights, and, laughing, went deep into the forest. Along the way, They discussed what horrors could await them, and each of them added something of their own. "And if we meet a ghost?" Sveta asked jokingly, rolling her eyes. "Or a maniac who lives in the forest and catches tourists," Igor added, laughing. Maxim, the bravest of them, suggested a contest for the best scary story. They lit a fire and began telling their stories one by one. But soon, talking about ghosts and maniacs began to make them slightly uneasy. The night was getting darker, and the forest around them was filled with strange sounds. When it was Anna's turn, she told a story about how one day a group of teenagers got lost in the forest and came across an old hut. Inside, they found a diary that described the creepy events that had happened to the previous inhabitants. At the end of the story, she added that one of the teenagers had disappeared and was never found. "It's just a fantasy," Maxim said, but his voice was no longer as confident as before. Suddenly, they heard the cracking of branches. Everyone froze, listening. The sound came from the depths of the forest, and soon they saw a shadow slip between the trees. Their hearts began to beat faster. "It's probably just a deer," Igor tried to calm his friends, but his voice was shaking. However, fear began to take hold of them. They decided it was time to go to bed. Everyone climbed into their tent, but sleep would not come. The night dragged on, and each of them listened to the sounds of the forest. Suddenly, a loud scream was heard. Everyone jumped out of the tents and saw Sveta kneeling, pointing into the darkness. I saw him!" she screamed, shaking with fear. "Who?" asked Maxim, trying to hide his own fear. "A shadow! It was huge and moving quickly," Sveta answered, her voice shaking. The friends looked at each other, and horror was visible in their eyes. They decided that it would be best to leave the forest immediately. Quickly gathering their things, they began to move towards the exit. But the forest seemed to have become different. The trees were closer together, and the path they were walking on had disappeared. "We're lost!" Igor screamed in panic. "Don't panic!" Anna tried to calm them down. "Let's just move in one direction." They walked, but the forest became more and more inhospitable. Suddenly they heard a rustling sound behind them. Turning around, they saw that someone was watching them. It was the same shadow that Sveta had seen. It stood at the edge of the light and seemed to be waiting for them to take the next step. "Run!" Maxim shouted, and they ran in different directions, hoping that this would help them escape from their pursuer. Each of them ran in their own direction, but soon realized that the forest had become even more confusing. They shouted to each other, but the forest absorbed their voices. Soon they lost each other. Maxim, exhausted, stopped and leaned against a tree. He tried to calm his breathing, when suddenly he felt that someone was standing behind him. Turning around, he saw a shadow that was now closer than ever. It had no clear shape, but it emitted a terrible feeling. "Who are you?" Maxim asked, his voice shaking with fear. The shadow did not answer, but took a step forward. Maxim, overcome with panic, rushed to run. He did not know where, as long as it was far away from this creature. He ran until he fell to the ground, tired and scared. At this time, Anna and Igor were also trying to find each other. They shouted the names of their friends, but the forest absorbed their voices. Suddenly, they came across the old hut that Anna had mentioned in her story. They looked at each other and without saying a word decided to go inside. The hut was abandoned and there was complete darkness inside. They turned on the flashlights and began to examine the room. There was an old diary on the table. Opening it, they saw notes about how a group of teenagers who came to the forest disappeared. At the end of the diary was a note about how one of them became part of the forest, and the rest were doomed to wander forever.
It was a long time ago. I was 12 years old then. I remember my parents sold the house and we stayed for a week with our neighbors before leaving for another city. Their house was gloomy. You could say old, but on the other hand, it seemed like they had renovated it from the outside. We all slept in one big room. I remember how it happened a couple of days before leaving. We went to bed. I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. And the most interesting thing is that the feeling of fear was heightened in me. I lay there, kept tossing and turning, tried to fall asleep somehow, but it didn't work out. The night was moonlit, since the room was light from the moon. Suddenly I wanted to go to the toilet, but I was afraid to get up and go, and everyone was sleeping nearby. After lying there for a while, I finally decided to get up and go to the toilet. I get up, leave the room where everyone is sleeping, go into the kitchen to go turn on the light and get to the toilet. And suddenly I see how in the darkness without light, at the kitchen table, someone is sitting. I see a form dark from the moonlight that comes into the kitchen through the window. The most interesting thing is that by the appearance of the person sitting at the table, I realized that it was a man. Well, I thought, maybe Dad was sitting here and fell asleep at the table. But on the other hand, why is he without light and sitting in such a pose? Not like the pose of a sleeping person. After looking at him for a couple of seconds, I decided to ask, Dad, what are you doing here in the dark? But he is silent and seems to remain in this pose without moving. I became wildly scared. But I still believe that it was most likely Dad who fell asleep, although he is sleeping in that room now. I can't tell you how scared I was at that moment. My hair stood on end. Goosebumps ran all over my body, and the feeling of fear went off the scale to the limit. I remember how I reached for the light switch in the kitchen and, having turned it on, suddenly discovered that there was no one at the table. He just disappeared. At that moment, I almost passed out from fear. I didn't want to go to the toilet and ran like a bullet into my bed and covered my head and tried to fall asleep, shaking with wild fear. Here is an incident from my life. The black silhouette of a man who was sitting at the kitchen table was clearly visible in the darkness.
It happened at the beginning of November. It so happened that I urgently needed to go to the dacha and pick up some valuables that I had accidentally forgotten there since the summer. I live in the city, and the dacha is about 20 kilometers from home. It's a long way to get there. After the metro, you still have to shake on the electric train for half an hour. I went after work, terribly late. As a result, I got on the last electric train at about 12:30 at night. By the time I got to the right station, it was over an hour. There were no people around, and the dacha was still a couple of kilometers away through a forest belt. It was cold, terribly cold. There was almost no civilization, only 2 dim lanterns by the platform. There were no taxis there either. Wildness. But there was nowhere to go. I quickened my pace and began to calm myself down internally. The moon had just begun to wane, so its light still illuminated my path quite well. The first 3 minutes were quiet and calm, until I entered the forest. The narrow path under the fallen leaves and a thin layer of either snow or frost was almost invisible. I was walking at random. Suddenly the night silence was broken by the sharp creak of a breaking tree branch, exactly where I had passed a minute ago. Horror washed over me like a wave. I felt hot. I instinctively turned around. The moon illuminated a huge silhouette rapidly approaching me. At that moment I had no time for reflection. I ran forward in panic, clutching my bag. Behind me I heard loud breathing and a low growl. I had the complete feeling that a wild animal was chasing me. It caught up with me catastrophically quickly. I only managed to scream, after which I fell, and it hung over me. I was shaking. Heat and a tart animal smell emanated from its body. It deafened me with its loud breathing, stood right above me and began to sniff my head and neck. The moon disappeared behind the clouds. Only sensations remained, impenetrable darkness and the burning rage of a predator above me. The beast swung its paw with the sharpest claws, tearing my jacket off. Its next swing hit me right in the stomach. I couldn't even scream from horror. It seemed like my heart was stopping. When its teeth came into play, I was already saying goodbye to life. It tore my clothes several times around the neck. The moon came out again, and the last thing I saw was how the massive muzzle of a wolf-like beast with burning eyes and an open mouth was descending towards my neck. I closed my eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a drawn-out howl was heard. The beast above me was distracted to answer its terrible interlocutor. Its howl covered me completely. I still didn't dare look at him. There was silence for a few seconds, after which a new call sounded from afar, and then the monster that had tried to have dinner with me ran off to its relatives. I looked around, it was empty and the moon was shining again. I ran to the dacha, opened the door with shaking hands and locked it with all the locks. I still couldn't fall asleep. I treated the oblique wounds on my stomach, which were aching terribly. I packed my things, and in the morning my brother came for me. I told him everything. They decided to sell the dacha. We consulted and came to the conclusion that it couldn't have been a wolf. Wolves are 3 times smaller than my terrible pursuer. Either it was the devil himself, or a werewolf. Don't walk around at night, children.
Dorm. When I entered the institute, I got a place in a dormitory. I was incredibly happy about it. Many of my classmates lived in rented apartments, which, in my opinion, does not convey the full atmosphere of student years. I lived in a sectional dormitory. For those who do not know, I will explain. On the landing there is one door, and behind it is a corridor, then 8 rooms in a circle, then a kitchen. In the center are toilets and sinks. Previously, there were showers, but due to the appearance of either fungus or mold, they were moved to the basement. I lived in a room for 2, if memory serves. This is 12 square meters. Everything is as usual. Those who have lived know, 2 beds on either side of the wall, a desk between them. Behind my bed there was a closet closer to the front door, and in front of the door itself there was a nightstand. Behind this very nightstand we kept the very same bag with garbage bags. It all started in a banal way. When I fell asleep, I often heard the rustling of these same bags, but somehow I attributed it all to extraneous noises. That I was tired, dozed off. I heard it, then, when the same noise was heard by a neighbor, and she, by the way, was many times more impressionable than me. She quickly darted to the light switch, but all the bags were in place. We decided that it was mice. I will refute everyone at once. There was always sanitary treatment, and we definitely did not have mice, but at that moment it did not matter. It was calmer this way. Looking ahead, I will say, I am familiar with sleep paralysis, how it occurs, as a result of which, why and how it proceeds, I know theoretically, and I can assure you that this was definitely not it. When it all happened, I was fast asleep and had my 10th dream, when I dreamed that someone was strangling me, and the most interesting thing is that I could clearly see and distinguish this someone. Unfortunately, at the moment I cannot describe what I saw. My memory has carefully erased this moment, but I remember exactly what I saw, and it was wildly scary just from the look of the strangler, and everything would be fine, if at one moment I had not realized that this was not a dream. I really could not breathe. Something or someone was squeezing my neck with incredible force. When I realized that I was not sleeping and that this horror was continuing with me in reality, the first thing I tried to do was to throw off the attacker, but my efforts were not crowned with success. This something clung to me even more tightly. Then I began to call my neighbor, but her voice was treacherously hoarse and escaped in a half-whisper. I don't know what scared me. either my persistence or the neighbor's movements, but I was able to breathe normally. At that moment there was no horror, no fear, only a feeling of liberation. The next morning there were 2 bruises on my neck. You couldn't tell the fingers apart if it had been a hand, just bruises, like from contusions. I was scared after everything. When I realized that everything that had happened was real, what it was and why, I am still at a loss. I still didn't leave my dorm. I lived there until the end of my studies and nothing else happened, so I never found an explanation for this incident. Someone said that it was a brownie, but I don't believe that version. If it was him, then he is very strange, and I will never forget the feeling of horror when I saw him.
This story was told by the mother of a good friend of mine. She was born and raised in a small village, which was located in the middle of nowhere. In the 1950s, there weren't even any roads there. Communication with the mainland was provided by a helicopter. Once a week, it landed in a field outside the village, bringing the necessary goods to the village store and doing the work of a regular bus. The heroine of this story lived with her mother and grandmother at the time. Since there were no men in the house, the care of the family fell on the shoulders of the mother. She spent almost all her time in the fields and meadows of the collective farm, earning workdays to somehow feed her family. Well, the grandmother did the housework. When the girl grew up, she became the old woman's main assistant, doing feasible housework. One summer, in the middle of haymaking, the mother was working in the distant meadows, and the grandmother and granddaughter started a big wash. At that time, washing machines were unheard of. The laundry was soaked in large basins and then rubbed on ribbed boards. Then the washed clothes were taken to a small pond in the middle of the village pasture, where a special bridge was built for rinsing. By the way, there had long been unkind rumors about this pond in the village. By lunchtime, the laundry was washed and put in a wide basin with handles. The grandmother, tired after hard work, lay down to rest and asked her granddaughter to rinse the clean clothes. Just don't go to the lake at noon, for some reason she warned, otherwise, anything can happen there. However, the girl wanted to finish the work as soon as possible, so that later with a clearer conscience she could go play with the boys. But the 10-year-old girl couldn't drag a heavy basin to the lake alone, so she invited her friend to come along. The girls got to the lake quickly, having conveniently laid out the laundry on the bridge. They began to rinse it in the warm water, chatting cheerfully. And suddenly the girl's attention was drawn to a strange movement on the opposite bank. Of course, one could assume that someone was swimming, but everyone in the village knew that it was impossible to go into the water in that place. The entire bank there was overgrown with thick reeds, and the bottom was covered with thick, nasty mud. The girls tried for a long time to see what was happening on the opposite bank, but the sun was shining too brightly, the water sparkled and blinded their eyes. Still, for a moment it seemed to them that a woman with long hair flashed by the bushes, and then everything calmed down. The girls decided that they imagined it and got back to work. They took a large duvet cover made of coarse canvas out of the basin and lowered it into the water. My friend's mother still remembers what happened next with horror. The duvet cover immediately disappeared into the water and seemed to have grown to the bottom. It seemed as if someone was holding it under the water with terrible force. The girls grabbed the end of the duvet cover with both little hands, trying to pull it back. It was useless. The fabric could not be moved. Not understanding what was happening, the girls began to cry and beg with tears. "Let go of our duvet cover, please, we'll get it at home." Apparently, the creature that was at the bottom, most likely, it was a mermaid, took pity on the little ones. The duvet cover came off the bottom and was easily pulled out of the water. Not risking continuing the work, the girls quickly threw the unrinsed laundry into the basin and quickly left the pond. It turns out that it was not for nothing that the old-timers said that you can't go to the pond at noon.
I remember my childhood quite well. It was not joyful and it cannot be called happy. I grew up frail and sickly. I was developmentally delayed until 4.5 years old. I did not speak, only uttered incomprehensible sounds. The most vivid memory of my childhood still gives me goosebumps and a sticky feeling of fear, as usually happens when a person encounters something that he cannot explain. My mother raised me alone and worked all day, leaving me with my grandmother. According to her, at that time she left for another city and, of course, my grandmother looked after me. She was already quite old and walked with difficulty. I remember her kind wrinkled face and already faded blue eyes. She wore funny polka dot scarves and flowered robes. She always smelled like something like fresh milk or fresh bread. I loved to climb onto her lap and listen to her muffled, but still pleasant voice. She told me many interesting stories, but unfortunately, I didn't remember them. Of course, that day, Granny went to the store and left me to watch TV for a while, although she was not a supporter of it, but apparently thought that it should distract me. I remember that she was gone for a long time and I was very scared, because I, like all small children, was very afraid when adults were late. When I had already started to whine, Granny returned, but without any purchases. Although it was hard for her to walk, she never showed it. But when she returned, it was noticeable that she was in great pain. There were tears in her eyes, and I myself began to cry. But she began to calm me down and in the end I fell asleep. The following days I began to notice oddities, but at that age, of course, I did not connect them. I simply noted that something had changed in her behavior. She hardly spoke to me. Her face was angry and distorted. And also, she began to smell strange. So sweet, but at the same time terribly unpleasant. She regularly cooked porridge for me and put me to bed. But when I wanted to climb into her lap, I was scolded. I remember that then I cried for a long time from resentment. The smell from her grew stronger, and even now I shudder. It was such a disgusting aroma. I remember that my grandmother, with difficulty, drawing out words and coughing terribly, talked to my mother on the phone, saying that everything was fine. And one morning, I woke up and realized that my grandmother was not there. I walked around the house and looked for her, and then cried for a long time. I had a real hysteria. That was the first time I spoke, and my first word was, "Grandma." The neighbor, hearing my squeals, persistently rang the doorbell to find out if everything was okay. Apparently she called my mother. A few hours later, my mother arrived and I saw confusion and incomprehension on her face. That day, she left me with the neighbor and was gone for a long time. Only in the evening she returned and cried all evening. And then she walked around sad and dressed only in black. I never saw my granny again. But when I grew up, I found out what really happened. It turns out that when my grandmother went to the store, a pack of dogs attacked her in one of the dark alleys. Feral mongrels mauled her and dragged her behind the garbage bins. On the very day my mother returned, the garbage bins were being taken out and my granny's half-rotted body was discovered. Because it was hot then. My mother claimed that she herself was in complete shock when she realized she had talked to my granny when she was already dead. And after that, my mother went to church for a long time and often took me with her. We lit many candles for her repose and even invited a priest to bless our apartment. I don't know how to explain everything that happened, but I'm sure that my grandmother didn't want to hurt me. Only this terrible cloying smell of rotting human body still haunts me. A friend of mine told me this short story the other day over a cup of beer. I won't go into too much detail, much less embellish it. I'll tell it as it is, briefly and without excess. Our neighbor Aunt Valia, who lived on the first floor, recently died, and then the day of the funeral came. When they started to carry out the coffin, the door lock jammed, not wanting to unlock the front door. And before that this had never happened to it, it always opened and closed properly. But then this happened. They opened it with the key from the other way around, and poked it like that, it wouldn't go. And that's it. And this was at such a moment. They tried to remove the lock, But nothing worked. Either they couldn't find a screwdriver, or the threads would break and the bolts would turn, or something else would happen. We suffered for about an hour, and a decision was made to carry the coffin with the deceased right out the window. Fortunately, we lived on the first floor. The problem was solved. They carried it out and drove to the cemetery. They buried it. Basically, did everything as it should be and started getting ready to go home. The whole family got into the car, but it wouldn't start. We pushed it this way and that, and tried everything, but it wouldn't start. Everything would be fine, but there was mud. While they were pushing, everyone was up to their ears in mud. After many attempts, they still couldn't start it. The car was new, recently bought, and then someone said, "Grandma, let us go home," or something like that. Suddenly, the car started right away, to everyone's surprise, but it refused to move, as if someone was holding it from behind, not letting it go. "Grandma, let us out!" And the car finally started. There were no more such strange things with the car. It didn't end there. At night, there was a knock on the door. They didn't knock. They just banged. Everyone in the apartment heard it. They came to the door. Of course, there was no one there. I've heard such things before, but I'm inclined to think that it was no longer the deceased who was coming. Of course, we didn't open the door. Even the deceased's daughter-in-law, opening her eyes in the middle of the night, saw the silhouette of the deceased in the light of the burning lamp, screaming obscenities and fear throughout the apartment and raising everyone to their feet. This continued for the first few days. Then everything stopped. The 40th day arrived. My friend's mother, the friend who is the narrator of this story, was sitting in the kitchen in the morning with a headache, sipping tea, leaning a hot glass to her temple and thinking whether to go or not to go to the wake, because they had lived in the same building almost their entire lives and had become like family. She said the phrase out loud, "Forgive me, Aunt Valia, but I probably won't be able to come to you today." After these words, the glass cracked and broke with a pop, spilling tea all over the dressing gown, but did not burn the woman with boiling water. Now, without thinking, she, although with a severe headache, went to remember her neighbor, and at the funeral, of course, there was a mystical coincidence. A sparrow flew in through the window, flew under the ceiling, gave a lap of honor around the room, and then flew back.
This incident happened to me on the evening of May 9th. I was returning home from friends. It was not late in the evening, somewhere around 9. I decided to shorten the way home and drove along the bypass road, a highway leading through the forest. Before the turn to my house, about 50 meters away, I saw a boy. I let off the gas, looking at him, short, about 12 years old, fair-haired. He attracted my attention because he was completely alone on the highway, and also naked, in a poisonous orange t-shirt and jeans. A thought flashed through my head, where are the parents looking? A child on the road in the evening, alone, and even in a t-shirt, and outside, rain. He, not paying any attention to the passing cars, continued to spin on the side of the road. When the distance between us was reduced to about 10 meters, I slowed down, and he, having looked at the car, rushed towards the forest and disappeared behind a small hillock near the road, and disappeared. I pulled over to the side of the road, stopped and for several minutes tried to peer towards that hillock. The boy was gone. I got out of the car, walked towards the place where the boy had run. No one. I walked around the hillock. It turned out to be an entrance to a sewer, overgrown with grass. I tried to move the hatch with my foot. Useless. So, he couldn't have hidden there. Curiosity was growing. I walked a few meters towards the forest. It was getting dark outside, but the place was open, young plantings. An orange t-shirt would have been visible from afar. There was no one. I stood for a while and, realizing that I was already soaking wet, decided to go back. While I was walking, I thought about what had happened. I had a thought in my head about where the boy could have gone. As I was walking to the car, my attention was drawn to an unusually shaped stone under a lonely tree standing by the road. Coming closer, I suddenly realized that it was not a stone, but an unusually shaped monument that is placed along roads in memory of an accident that happened. The monument was overgrown with grass and was hiding in broken branches. Having cleared it a little, I noticed a photograph. Looking at it, I involuntarily recoiled. From the photo, a smiling face of a small blond boy, 12 years old, was looking at me. It became creepy, but at the same time, somehow calm. I did not want to leave. Squatting down, I wiped the raindrops from the photo. What could have happened to him? An accident? A picture flashed before my eyes, the screeching of brakes, the scream of a child, the panic of the driver, silence and a lonely monument under a tree near the road. Not a trace remained of the joy of the day spent. I was shivering, either from the cold or from fear. Why did I see this boy? What made me stop? I left a chocolate bar I found in the glove compartment on the monument. I was returning home in the pouring rain. It is unbearable when children leave life. I want to scream and howl in pain when someone's little life ends in an instant.
In the summer of 2013, my whole family went on vacation to my father's native land. The distance was not short, but we took the risk of going by car. We were greeted very well. I had never met half of my relatives before. After visiting his closest relatives in the city, my father wanted to see his aunts. His aunts were already very old women living in the neighboring villages. Early in the morning we went to see them, moving from one village to another. We arrived in a village where my father's cousin also lived. We threw a big party to celebrate our arrival. Well, I, with her grown-up children, went to a village cafe. We returned to their home late at night. My parents with the rest of the older relatives were walking in another house, promising to pick me up early in the morning and return to the city. And so, walking in pitch darkness, constantly stumbling over all sorts of bumps and cursing under my breath because there wasn't even one lantern, I saw the faint outlines of a fence around some garden. How many trees there were in it. Then they announced to me that we had finally arrived. At about 5 a.m., they woke me up, gave me tea with homemade bread, sour cream, homemade butter, and told me that my parents had come to pick me up. When I went out onto the porch, I saw that the fence didn't belong to a garden, but to a cemetery. It was separated from their house by a distance of about 2 meters. They explained to me that they were used to such a neighborhood, and that they were generally cold-blooded people. But one of my father's aunts, a grandmother of about 80, scolded my father. "You should go to your mother's grave. It's like she brought you here. You haven't been here for a long time and no one knows when you'll be back in our area." Father said that he would definitely come again in a few days. But now we are in a hurry. We must try to leave early. It should be noted that I have never seen my grandmother. She died a very, very long time ago, and I have never been to her grave. Having hurried us all to get into the car, Father turned on the ignition key. The car did not start. He tried again, nothing. For about 20 minutes, Father twisted something under the hood, knocked, listened, started again, all in vain. Terribly nervous, not knowing where to go now to diagnose the car, which looked completely fine. Father said that we could drink tea. There was nowhere to hurry now, and he would think. Then Mother told Father to go to Mother's grave, and Father, surrounded by relatives, went to the cemetery. He and Mother tidied up the grave. Father remembered his childhood. Mother was silent about something. Soon everyone returned back. At home, Dad, not hoping for anything, nevertheless tried to start the car again, and suddenly there was a measured and deep hum of the engine. The car started so indifferently, as if it had not kept us in bewilderment for almost an hour. One of the old ladies said, "Mom didn't let you go, son. You went to visit, and now she let you go with a light heart. Go, Seryojenka." I knew why Dad was silent the whole way. He, like all of us, was wondering, is this really true?
I have been living in this house for over 30 years. An ordinary 9-story brick building. 2nd floor. I know all the neighbors well. At least, I was sure of it until recently. A small digression. The year 2013. A difficult period in my life. The death of my mother. Divorce from my husband. I was left alone with 2 children. In general, the cycle of events whirled me around. I stopped noticing what was happening around me a long time ago. I went into problems, as they say, head over heels. I always remembered that above us, on the third floor, lived a certain average family, quiet and positive. Their son grew up, graduated from the seminary, took the priesthood, got married, 3 children. He moved with his family from our house. Their father died. An elderly single mother remained living in the apartment above us, to whom her son, a priest, periodically brought her grandchildren. This is all the typical information that we usually know about our neighbors. The priest's children are small and noisy. When he brought them to his mother, there would be an earthquake above our heads. The whitewash would literally fall from the ceiling from the patter of children's feet. Often, especially in the summer, children's voices could be heard on the balcony, which was, naturally, located right above our balcony. I got used to the constant restless background noise above my head and simply did not pay attention to it. And recently I noticed that for some reason the children upstairs began to stomp mainly at night. This surprised me. Why do small children, when visiting their grandmother, not sleep until 4 to 5 o'clock in the morning? What kind of anarchy is this? Or did the grandmother decide to allow her grandchildren absolutely everything in order to spoil them in the absence of their parents? And the patter of children's feet was joined by a certain clicking of small claws, characteristic of a small dog running. But I never heard barking. In general, the noise at some point became irritatingly loud, and I decided to go up to the neighbors on the 3rd floor and talk to everyone about it. Since I have a small child myself, who is kept awake at night by this sound bacchanalia. Several times I tried to ring the doorbell of the neighbors upstairs, but, as luck would have it, I never found them at home. I also tried to walk more often with my youngest child in the yard, hoping to meet a neighbor walking her dog, who was clicking his claws on the floor, but I never met her. I also did not know the neighbor's phone number, and it occurred to me to go to our housing management, find out their phone number, and finally settle the brewing conflict. On the reception day, I came to the head of the housing management with the above-mentioned request, and his answer shocked me. He said, "Why do you need the phone number of this apartment? They haven't lived there for almost a year." Then I asked if they were renting out the apartment, and told them about the noise that was bothering us every night. The head of the housing office assured me that the apartment was completely empty. No one was renting it out, and looked at me like I was crazy. I left completely stupefied. When it got dark, I went out into the yard on purpose to see if the lights would come on in the windows of the neighbors upstairs. The windows remained dark. I don't understand what's going on. My brain refuses to analyze all this. It's night now. In the apartment above, the patter of children's feet and the clicking of animal claws can be clearly heard again. I'm scared. I'm saying the Our Father, and I'm afraid to even imagine who's making such a noise up there in the empty and dark apartment. Empty eye sockets. When I was 17, my friends offered me a part-time job at the dream holiday home for the summer months. There was nothing to do, and I was at that age when I wanted to feel the taste of my own hard-earned money. The holiday home was outside the city. Beautiful places. A river. The work was not easy, but I remember this time with especially good feelings. We worked in the kitchen of this luxurious establishment. Our chef was a kind-hearted person, a professional in her field, Aunt Luba. That's what we called her. She did not welcome pathos among her workers, as she called us. We went to work at 5 o'clock in the morning on the bus of this organization. I already mentioned that the road went far out of town. It ran past a suburban cemetery. One day, returning from a shift on the bus, tired but happy, I found a free seat in the cabin. It ended up on the same seat with Mrs. Luba. We were talking. She loved to talk. When we started driving past the cemetery, Mrs. Luba suddenly looked in his direction and said, "Today is 20 years since my daughter's death. We need to remember her." I looked at her in surprise and asked, "Did you have another daughter? You do have other grown-up children, right?" "Yes, I have an adult son, but 20 years ago, at the age of 10, my first daughter Olga died," she answered. In response to my unobtrusive request to tell me under what circumstances this happened, she told me this difficult story. She was born to us, as they say, with empty eye sockets. Have you ever seen such eyes? This is when the tear duct is not visible in the inner corner of a person's eye. This is especially visible in photographs. This is a bad omen. They say that such people do not live long. Over the years, anxiety no longer made itself felt. Only when Alia turned 9, my father and I bought her a beautiful coat. We asked her to try on her new thing. We were so happy. But even then, after trying it on boringly, she said to us, "I won't wear it anyway," and left it lying on the chair. She was a strange child for us. Withdrawn, thoughtful. She loved books. They were our friends, but we doted on her. She loved water very much. That is, to be near bodies of water, be it a river or a lake. She loved going fishing with her father, and one day, they went fishing together again on our river. When they first arrived, she had already, according to my husband, dived into the water and never came back up. That day, my sister, Alia's aunt, came running to me, without even taking off her shoes. She immediately asked me in the hallway, "Where's Olga?" I said that I had gone fishing with my father. My sister, in great excitement, told me her dream that she had seen the day before. "I dream that I see Olga sitting on the bank of the river." Suddenly a huge black hand emerged from the water, like a cloud, and took Olga into the water with it. I was alarmed. My heart started pounding, but I had no way of contacting them at that moment. Of course, at that time, later my husband arrived, bringing with him the most terrible news in my life. Aunt Luba fell silent. I was silent too. I only looked at the face of this woman, which I probably only now was able to really look at. Always laughing, full of energy. At 50 years old, she could give any of us a run for her money. She was sitting now, holding her head straight, and practically not blinking her eyes. They found her only on the 3rd day. Divers pulled her out. My distraught husband did not leave the other side all these days. I certainly could not get out of bed. It turns out that her hair got caught on a snag lying on the bottom, and then her body was carried into some hole, which is why they could not find her right away. So that's how it is. My dear, today it's been 20 years since she died. And with a smile she added, "Well, then don't believe in omens, folk ones. It's time to go out. Well, shall we go, Beauty?"
I have never told this story to anyone and will not. I am afraid that they will twist their temples, and I really do not like when I am not taken seriously. It does not matter in general. I will write. One night I was guarding the office. The work is not dusty. The main thing was not to let anyone in except the management, and to make sure that it did not flood. The pipes were terrible. Everyone always saves on everything. The door was noble, steel and massive. No one would break it. The responsibilities are minimal, but it is boring. It is good that at least there was a computer with games, and for that I am grateful. I spent the nights from Saturday to Sunday in the office. Everything was always calm. And the director, the manager, and I had the keys, so there should not have been any surprises. So, one night, on Saturday, I was playing on the computer and suddenly heard some noise from the other side of the door. I went over, looked through the peephole, no one. Decided that I imagined it and sat down at the computer again. I had barely sat down when something began to scrape again and I heard an unintelligible male voice. Then a knock on the door. I decided that it was the director who had come to see me. I inserted the key into the lock and looked through the peephole again, still no one. I asked, "Nikolai Genedyevich, is that you?" Silence in response. And then a female voice, mumbling something unintelligible. Again, did not understand anything. I loudly and clearly told them off and threatened to call the police, although instead of a phone there was only an emergency firefighter button. A couple of seconds later the female voice fell silent and a barely audible knock was heard on the window. I opened the blinds and was dumbfounded. No! I almost died on the spot. Fear literally knocked the ground out from under my feet. I sat down on the floor where I was standing. There was a man hanging on the bars. I wanted to think it was a man. Every centimeter of him was unnatural. It felt like someone had only seen people in movies, made himself a human suit and put it on. The absolutely sexless creature stared at me with its bulging eyes and began to mumble in a male and female voice alternately, with some kind of disgusting whistle. His facial expressions were clearly inhuman. Each facial muscle moved completely out of sync with the others, in different directions. I don't know what he was holding onto the bars with, but his arms and legs twitched in some kind of asynchronous fits. I sat on the floor and couldn't move. I've never seen anything more terrifying in my life. Suddenly the sounds died down. He turned his head 100 degrees, as if he noticed something on the street, froze for a few seconds and jumped down, mumbling inarticulate words in a different, low, trembling voice. I pulled the blinds closed, fell to the floor like a felled man and cried like a little child, unable to hold back the trembling throughout my body. I sat like that until the morning, unable to move, frightened by every rustle. I lost 5 kilos and often have nightmares at night. Luckily for me, it was distracted by something else. Otherwise I wouldn't be writing this story to you now. Lucky me!
Once upon a time there lived a boy. He lived in an apartment. In the neighboring apartment lived a lonely old lady, and this old lady neighbor died one day, and the boy had a dream at night, as if he was in a school lesson, as if there was a dictation, and the teacher was reading a text. Under no circumstances should you look at the coffin. Under no circumstances should you look at the coffin. Under no circumstances should you look at the coffin. When the boy woke up, he decided that, just in case, he would not look out the window during the funeral. When the funeral began and a funeral march began to play under the windows, the boy lay down on the couch and decided not to get up until the funeral was over, and so he did. Soon the funeral procession left. The boy lay down for a while, then got up. In the evening he watched TV. There they said that today there was a funeral of an honored artist named such and such. They showed their house, they showed people with black mourning armbands, they showed a coffin. The boy's heart almost jumped out of his chest from fear. He never expected that they could show this coffin on TV, which you can't look at. The next night he dreamed of a dictation again. The teacher read the text. The old woman with a cheerful hand broke the first board out of the coffin. The second night he dreamed of a dictation again. The old woman joyfully and cheerfully broke the second board out of the coffin. The third night again, the cheerful old woman tensed up a little and broke the third board out of the coffin. And so it went on for 6 more nights. The last dream had the following text: singing a song. The old woman broke the 9th and last board out of the coffin. The joyful old woman climbed out of the grave and is walking towards your house. The old woman is walking towards your entrance. The old woman went up to your floor. The old woman confidently opened the door of the neighboring apartment. Then the boy finally woke up in horror. He put his ear to the wall that was shared with the neighboring apartment and began to listen. At first there were no sounds, then he made out some footsteps, then some strange sounds. It was as if the neighbor had actually returned, that she was walking around her apartment and singing some cheerful song. Then the sounds died down, and then, like a bolt from the blue, the doorbell rang in the boy's apartment. The boy's legs buckled from fear and he fell to the floor. Then he gathered his strength and shouted, "Mom, Dad, they're calling," but neither Mom nor Dad was visible. The boy went to their room, but his parents were not there. They were nowhere in the apartment, and the doorbell kept ringing. At night, the bell seemed so deafening and disgusting. The boy went up to the door and asked in a whisper, "Who's there?" There was only silence in response. Then there was a very loud knock on the door, so strong that one of the door's planks bounced off, from somewhere above, as if from the ceiling. The teacher's voice came, with a confident hand. The old woman broke the first board out of the door. Then there was a second knock, and again a voice. The old woman, blinded by wild rage, cheerfully and casually broke the second board out of the door. The boy realized that soon the old woman would break the entire door, enter the apartment and kill him. He began to think about what old women dislike more than anything else in the world. The answer immediately came to mind: loud modern music. The boy quickly turned on his favorite band on a computer. Set the volume to maximum. 5 minutes passed. 10. Half an hour. No one broke into the apartment. The boy then opened the front door. There, behind the door, lay the blackened corpse of his neighbor. This corpse had its hands over its ears, and its face was distorted by a spasm of suffering. We had just moved into a new apartment on the outskirts of the city. The forest was visible from the window, a stone's throw away. In August, I looked out the window and saw people coming out of the forest with full baskets. Mushrooms had appeared, and I wanted to go into the forest to pick mushrooms. My husband did not support me. He stayed home with the child. I took a bucket, a knife and went. The road went past the fields to the collective gardens. The forest began right behind the field sown with rye. I almost ran into the forest. I thought that the mushrooms were waiting for me right there, under the first bush, but the further I went into the forest, the more anxious I became. At first, I tried to keep the field road in sight and focused on the sounds of the highway, which passed to the left of me. Then I myself did not understand how I got distracted. The path in the forest became narrower and narrower. I stopped, caught my breath, thought that there were no more mushrooms in the forest. They had ended and decided to turn back, but it was not to be. The forest behind me rose up like a wall. I had just passed here, and now I can't. I had to go around the thick bushes, so I turned left, then again, and again. The road disappeared from view. The forest became suspiciously quiet, and then I became so scared that the hair on my head stood on end and my legs became weak. Suddenly I heard the cracking of branches and thought that one of the mushroom pickers was walking nearby, so I followed the noise. I found myself on the path again. I was happy. I walked, waving my bucket, only suddenly there was a squelching sound under my feet. I stopped again, looked closely and realized that I was standing at the edge of a swamp, and the one who was walking ahead and flashing through the trees was standing in the reeds, right in the center of this swamp, someone green, like a high hummock on legs. And then it dawned on me that all this was for a reason. I said out loud that I didn't need the mushrooms and asked to let me out. The hummock grunted, contentedly, almost joyfully. I turned around and took off running. How I ran from there! There was only a whistling sound in my ears. 5 minutes later the path led me to the road. I turned around. The forest was sparse, translucent, as if I had gotten lost in 3 pines. Since then I have never set foot in the forest alone. Scary.
Mysterious disappearance in the village. There have been bad rumors about a small village for a long time. Many people told stories about how a witch named Marie lived there long ago. She lived alone. No one really talked to her. She wore the same old dress, patch after patch, and on the night of Ivan Kupala she disappeared somewhere. When Marie was very old and sick, she never left her house. One day, the neighbors, out of solidarity, decided to visit the sick woman. After all, she was in agony. They should go and see her. Several people went into the witch's house, but did not come out. Rumors began to spread that Marie had died with sins on her soul, and she took the neighbors who came to see her with her. Soon, a fire broke out in the village. Many houses burned down, but the witch's house remained almost intact. Time passed. Very few people remained to live in the village. There were only a few residential buildings. All the old huts had broken and shattered windows. Only one uninhabited house, Marie's house, had undamaged windows. One woman, her name was not given, decided to buy a plot of land in this village. She knew nothing about the witch, the disappearance of people, or the mysterious house. Having arrived in this village and inspected the plot, the woman decided to walk around and look at the village. After all, she would have to live there. Since the houses were mostly uninhabited, she decided to go into the first residential house she came across and meet the neighbors. Fate sent the woman Marie's house. Walking past it and seeing the intact windows, the strong boards of the house itself, she decided that it was still a residential house. The woman slowly entered the yard, walked around the house, but did not notice how someone's pale face appeared in one of the corner windows, the features of which were difficult to make out. The woman still thought that the house was empty, but heard the phone ring in the house. Moreover, it did not ring intermittently, but with one continuous ring. The woman nevertheless went into the house. The ringing stopped. The woman began to walk around the house and call the owners, but no one answered. The strangest thing is that she never found the phone that supposedly rang. In the corner, near the stove, There was an old photograph. The woman came up and picked up the photograph. It showed a woman with small black eyes and a sharp hooked nose. Her face seemed a little unpleasant. She put the photograph back and hurried out of the strange house. She did not hear how muffled voices were heard in the house, how the face in the photograph was distorted, and how someone was calling for help. She went out and quickly walked towards the train station, which was not far from the village. Having walked about halfway, the woman felt steps behind her, as if someone was following her and trying to catch up. She finally forced herself to turn around. An old woman stood before her and looked her straight in the eyes. The woman recognized the face from the photograph, only now it was even more terrible. The eyes were even more evil. Rumors about the missing woman quickly spread, but only a few villagers could explain her mysterious disappearance.
An ancient hospital. It was in 2011. At that time, I was working as a doctor at the city clinical hospital. To begin with, the building in which the hospital was located is very old, more than 100 years old for sure, made in the brick style of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The three-story building is dark red in color and is located in the historical center of the city. In general, it was an ordinary building, at first glance, which did not cause any special emotions, but the urban legends about this building said otherwise. It was rumored that during the Civil War there were numerous repressive processes in numerous basements and catacombs connecting similar neighboring buildings, and that supposedly the restless martyrs were still experiencing the nightmare of the past there. I didn't believe it, as much as my medical education does not allow me to do such nonsense. Due to my work, I periodically worked the night shift, as a large number of patients needed round-the-clock supervision. After working for a while, I started learning from some doctors and health workers that strange things happen in the hospital at night, especially on the first and second floors. Shadows flicker in the depths of the corridors and on the landings. Strange noises and rustles are heard. Some people have nightmares. I decided to lie down on the couch in the resident's office after a hard day's work and immediately fell into a deep sleep. I distinctly remember someone's voice next to me, which sounded like an artificially synthesized one, calling me by my first name and patronymic, as if giving an order to address me as you. A split second later, a potted indoor flower fell next to my head, standing on a table 1.5 meters away from me. I was terrified. I could not rationalize this incident, because common sense argued that such a thing could not happen, since objects themselves do not fly or fall near my head. Of course, no one believed me this morning. They explained everything by the tricks of the draft from the window and my imagination. Well, if it's a draft, how could it form with the windows closed and the doors locked? Fortunately, no more strange things happened to me in this hospital.
I've been afraid of the dark since I was a kid. I don't remember why. It's just that every time I found myself in the dark, even as a teenager, I wanted to get out of it. No, not to leave, to get out, as quickly as possible, to where there is light. Now I have been able to overcome my fear. I calmly stay at night in my rented apartment. Now let's get to the point. Last week, my parents called me home for the new year. I arrived yesterday, arrived late, around 9, and went to bed almost immediately. The mother also asked at night, should I leave the light on for you? I didn't spend the night without him when I was a kid. I assured her that everything was fine and fell asleep. I woke up suddenly, as if I had just blinked. It was 3:15 on the clock and they were standing. I was scared. Have you ever seen an electronic clock in your life? Did those two dots blink between the hours and minutes? Strange memories came back to my mind. I instinctively turned my back to the wall and fell silent. I don't know how long it lasted. The clock was still standing, but I began to calm down, and then, soft footsteps rang through the room. It's quiet, but you can hear it perfectly at night, from the door to the window. Everything was quiet for a few seconds and the invisible man went to my bed. My breathing quickened, and my heart was pounding in my throat, and I felt hot breath on my face. Instantly, my memory woke up. I remembered why I was afraid of the dark, and how I had felt the same way when I was a child. I jumped up and reached the light switch in 2 jumps. Click, the light doesn't turn on. You still haven't learned anything. A low, barely audible voice sounded in my head. I huddled in the nearest corner and covered my face with my hands. I don't want to see what will appear out of the darkness. How are you, Laisha? It's been so long since we last met. The voice moved out of his head and sounded right next to his ear, so that the words burned his auricle. It was saying something, but I tried not to pay attention, hearing only some phrases. You understand that the morning will not come just like that. I'll leave when you feed me. Open your face. I closed my eyes and tried to open the door with one hand, but it was locked. I won't let you go. I fell face down on the floor and sobbed. I really didn't want that. It ran its bony paw over me. I missed you, Lyosha. I was starving. Why did you leave the light on at night? Why did you torture me? I started crying. Here, good boy, now take your hands off your face. Slowly, as if in a dream, I removed them and felt a twinge of pain, all over the body. It seemed that his nerves would not stand up and burn out from overexertion. I felt a terrible cold, as if I were left in outer space and, at the same time, a heat, as if I were burning in the center of a star. And finally I was left in absolute darkness, just me and nothing. I feel the touch of slimy tentacles, fear, pain and humiliation, all the feelings that every dying person on the planet is experiencing at this moment, from microbe to human, cheetah teeth on the throat, intoxication of the body, a bullet in the heart. It went on for ages and ended as abruptly as it began. It was morning. I woke up in my bed at home. My parents were still asleep. It took me a long time to come to my senses. I'll never be in the dark again, nowhere, even kilometers away from this room, never.
The cat is a savior. Preamble about the cat. I was looking for a furry companion, because it was unpleasant to sit at home alone, and I needed to take care of someone. I was thinking about a British cat, but then I came across a standard ad on the internet. We are giving away a 5-month-old kitten, to which a newborn child is allergic, and if we don't find a home, we will have to put the cat to sleep. And for some reason I really wanted to take this particular cat, although he was, in general, nothing special, an ordinary ginger cat. That same evening, the cat arrived in his new apartment. I named him Doctor after the hero of the science fiction series, not yet knowing that the name would be very suitable. The doctor turned out to be affectionate, although quite mischievous. He loved to sit in my arms and adored being scratched. About 6 months passed like this. That memorable morning, I had the strongest attack of my entire illness. Again, I have to explain, during the attacks that happen, or rather, happened, upon awakening, I am between sleep and reality, a nasty feeling when you realize that trouble has begun. You feel all the wild pain, but you cannot open your eyes, and if you do open them, you see everything in a distorted form. Consciousness becomes clouded, and you seem to be sucked into a giant funnel. But the most terrible thing has always been paralysis. That time, the whole event was dangerously delayed. My consciousness fell into the abyss over and over again, and then paralysis of the whole body and breathing set in. Usually everything was restored in about 10 seconds, of course, approximately, since it is impossible to count adequately in such a state. But this time passed, and there was no outcome. I realized that this was the end. Consciousness was restored. I even felt how the cat, who usually slept next to me, was rushing madly around me, but the functions of the body, not. But the most terrible thing was something else. A few seconds later, right above me, I heard heavy breathing. The longer I held my breath, the louder the something I heard began to snore. I was weakening, and it was breathing faster, louder, more predatory. To feel the presence of this creature, to hear these terrible sounds, this is a real, piercing, animal horror, in comparison with which the prospect of a quick end seemed like a happy deliverance. Probably, something similar is experienced by a soul falling into hell. Every moment turned into eternity. And then I felt a sharp, acute pain. It was none other than a gentle and kind cat who sank his teeth into the side of his mistress. My eyes opened wide, and above me, above my chest, I saw something like a cloud of gray fog. The next bite immediately followed. I took a sharp, deep breath, seeing that the entity hanging over me had disappeared, and the moment of its disappearance was not imprinted in my consciousness. It was just there, and then it was gone, as if with a snap of the fingers. While I was trying to catch my breath, the cat began to rush around the room, as if mad, and only a few minutes later I realized what horror my pet had saved me from. However, a metamorphosis occurred with the cat. From that very moment, he stopped allowing himself to be petted. To all attempts to reach out to him, he responded, and still responds, with a blow of the paw or a bite. He behaved restlessly, if not to say hysterically, almost stopped sleeping and became emaciated. After a trip to the dacha, the cat expressed a desire to stay with my grandparents, whom, unlike me, he allows to come near him. Now he lives with them, and I come to the old people every day and visit them, and my savior, Rythik, that's his name now, has grown rounder and calmer, although he is still very nervous and timid after that incident. He is afraid to be left alone indoors. I buy him the best food and thank him constantly for saving him. However, he still avoids my hands. Well, he probably has his reasons. And he hasn't had any attacks for a very, very long time.
Thunderstorm. Let me share with you an unusual story that happened to my mother in childhood. She came for summer holidays to the Tula region, the village of Lipetsi, where her kindest aunt Evdokia lived. From dawn to dusk, my aunt spent her time in daily chores. Of course, my mother sympathized with her, helped her as much as she could, but youth took its toll. She wanted to communicate with her friends, run to the hill to pick wild strawberries, weave wreaths, go mushroom picking. A family lived next door to them. They had a girl and a boy. The girl Tanya was attached to her elderly grandmother and younger brother, looked after them, and never left them far. But one day she decided to go mushroom picking. There were too many of them that year. Grandma warned her not to go. The sky was already overcast and clouds were coming. But the girl laughed loudly, took the basket, her little brother, and ran into the forest. She picked up a lot of mushrooms. When she was returning, it started to rain. Her little brother started to act up. Apparently, Tanya picked him up and hurried home, carrying the basket with difficulty. Then thunder struck. A huge bolt of lightning, cutting the space in two, struck the ground. The boy screamed in fear. His sister lay down on the ground, covering him with her body. The next bolt of lightning struck them. The grief for the family was terrible. Mom, still a child, was at the funeral, and she was shocked by the fact that her parents seemed to have turned to stone, and Grandma was kissing the closed coffins in oblivion. Since then, Mom has been terribly afraid of thunderstorms, lightning, and does not let us into the forest when it rains. Only 40 years later she brought us to her old village. We wandered through yards overgrown with viburnum and elderberry, stroked the seasoned trunks of plum and apple trees, found old children's toys in the nettles. We also went to the village cemetery, where Mom visits Tanchka and her brother. Coming out of the cemetery, we bumped into Granny. She was dragging a basket of boletus mushrooms from the pine forest. Mom was delighted and said loudly, "Girls, let's go for boletus mushrooms." Granny looked back at us, straightened her headscarf and said in a muffled voice, "It's not worth it, girls, don't go, a thunderstorm is coming." Mom waved us off. "The sky is clear, not a cloud." To which Granny raised her finger. I saw Tanchka in the field. It means a thunderstorm, and she trudged off towards the village. Mom shuddered, took us by the hands and went out onto the road to the house. When we approached the village, Mom looked back. The sky had become blacker than pitch. She said, it was not for nothing that Tanya warned us about the storm, and we hurried home.
A call from the grave. After the summer holidays, my group and I always gathered on August 30th to get some exercise before the school year. We tell stories about the summer holidays, where anyone was and what anyone was doing. And now our headman is crying his eyes out. "What's the matter with you?" we ask. And she told us. In June, her best friend died, hit by a car driven by a drunk driver. They were buried in a closed coffin. Sasha, the head of the group, was at the funeral. She cried a lot, and when it was time to drive nails into the lid, the mother of the deceased could not stand it, ran to the coffin, pulled back the lid and put her daughter's cell phone with the words, "Call, daughter, call." Mom was reassured. The funeral was over. A few nights later, a phone call rang in Sasha's apartment, and in her sleep, barely opening her eyes, she saw on the caller ID the number of her dead friend, their funny hugging photo. which Sasha had posted exactly the day before her friend's death. I was completely asleep, and there was no question of answering. And it's 3 o'clock in the morning. Sasha cried all the time, became nervous and irritable, and did not sleep at night, but the phone was silent. After a week or two, everything began to seem like nonsense, and that, most likely, she was just imagining things. How I was disturbed by the sound of my cell phone again at night. And that number again. Fear again. Sasha went to the deceased's mother and told her what had happened. Oddly enough, she was overjoyed, broke into a smile and offered to leave her cell phone at least for one night. Sasha did just that. And the next day, my aunt was already picked up by an ambulance with a heart attack. My friend's mom didn't say anything, just smiled strangely on the ambulance stretcher. Sasha looked at the call log and was horrified. 3 minutes was the call time on that number. Sasha decided to change the number urgently. I went to the mobile phone company. She asked after what time the numbers that are not in use are blocked and resold. She was told that it would be at least a year later, according to company policy. Then the poor guy made a printout of the calls to his number. And indeed, the phone received an incoming call 3 times from the same number that was buried.
Last working day. It happened 4 months ago. I'm a student, 21 years old, and I work part-time as a security guard in an office. I work the night shift 3 times a week. I have not noticed anything unusual during my entire work, and neither have my colleagues. And then one day the next working day came, Friday. I packed up all my things, overalls, flashlight, baton, and put down some food, boarded a bus and set off. When I arrived at the office, I changed my clothes and started waiting for them to give me the keys and the staff to leave the room. At 21 or 40, the office was completely empty. I locked the main door and got to work. The job wasn't particularly difficult. I had to make my rounds every hour and make sure nothing happened in the office. After making my rounds, I returned to the security room after closing the door. It was 23 o'clock on the clock, and I realized that it would be nice to have dinner. After taking out the sandwiches and making tea, I heard some rustling on the second floor, but I didn't pay attention to it. The security room was on the first floor. I started eating dinner, but the rustling didn't stop, and then I realized that I needed to check what was there. I'll do my rounds at the same time. I took a flashlight and a baton and went to the second floor. After carefully examining everything on the second floor, I noticed a silhouette at the end of a dark corridor. I'm not a timid guy, but I'm careful. After taking a couple of steps forward, I managed to realize that something was standing and just looking at me. I couldn't quite figure out what it was, so I took a couple more steps, and then I just froze. In front of me, I saw something that looked like a human, but it wasn't. The only thing I could see was the pale skin of the creature and a body that was covered with scars. I immediately turned around and ran to the security room and locked it. I took out my phone and wanted to dial the police, but out of the corner of my eye, through the window of the security room, I saw that it had come to me. I froze and just stared at him. I managed to make it out completely. It was skinny with pale skin, covered in scars. Fur was visible on some parts of its body. Some teeth were missing. Its eyes were very dark in color, and its nose was badly damaged, as if it had never existed. The skin clung to its bones, so it could be said with certainty that it was hungry and had found food for itself. We stared at each other for about 10 or 15 minutes, but then it moved to the door and just started knocking with its index finger, wanting me to let it in. 2 fingers were missing from his left hand. Then the knocking turned into heavy blows on the door, but I knew it wouldn't open the door because it was solid and the windows were thick enough. Despite his decrepit physique, the blows were very strong, and my fear grew stronger and stronger. I finally came to my senses, picked up the phone and started dialing the police. After specifying the exact location, I was asked to wait 7 to 10 minutes before the patrol arrived. Then, turning around, I saw that the creature had calmed down and started running away from the door. I saw that it had started to move back to the second floor, so I wasn't going to leave. The police arrived. They told me to open the door, but I couldn't leave the security room because I was still scared. Soon the head of the office arrived, opened the door. They took me out, and the office was thoroughly examined, but nothing was found. Then one of the guards who came to the office with the boss took me away from the patrol and said that he had seen the same thing 2 weeks before my shift, but could not call the police because there was no communication. The poor guy sat there until the morning, until the staff came and the office opened. After that, the second guard said that he never worked night shifts. Immediately, the boss sent me home. After getting enough sleep and recovering, I quit the office, and I never worked night shifts anymore.
Glass doll. Once upon a time, there lived a girl who loved dolls. Her parents took her to a store to choose a new toy. The girl walked around the store for a long time, looking for a doll she liked. Finally, she saw the most beautiful glass doll she had ever seen before. The girl asked her father to buy her a glass doll. Her father took the doll and looked at it carefully. Suddenly, the doll's eyes turned red, and the father threw it aside like a hot potato. "I don't like the look of this doll," said the father. "Something is wrong with her," and he refused to buy her. Then the girl asked her mother to buy a glass doll for her. "Your father doesn't like the look of this doll," said the mother. "I think you should choose another doll." But the girl began to stamp her feet and shout, "I want, I want, I want." Finally, the mother gave in and bought her a doll. That same day, the father had to go away for a day on a business trip. Still worried about his daughter and her new toy, he wrote the girl a note. It read, "Daughter, do not leave the glass doll in your room at night." The girl played with the doll all day, and before going to bed, she put it on the table next to her bed and fell asleep. A few minutes later, she heard a noise in the darkness of the room and jumped up in bed. In the darkness, she saw a pair of glowing red eyes. She thought it was a trick of the light and rubbed her eyes. When she looked again, the red eyes were closer. Thinking it was just her imagination, the girl rubbed her eyes again. When she looked again, the red eyes were very close to her face. She heard the doll whisper in her ear, "Lie down on the pillow. I promise I won't choke you." The girl laid her head on the pillow and the doll choked her. The girl's mother entered the room and saw her daughter lying dead on the bed. She ran up to her and hugged her tightly. The mother heard the doll whisper, "Lie down next to your daughter. I promise I won't strangle you." The mother lay down on the bed next to her daughter's body, and the doll strangled her too. When the girl's father returned home the next morning, he called for his wife and daughter, but there was no answer. He went up the stairs and entered his daughter's room. There he saw a terrible sight. His wife and daughter were lying dead on the bed, and between them sat a glass doll, laughing. In a rage, the father grabbed the glass doll and began to smash it against the floor and walls until he completely broke it. But there was nothing he could do to help his wife and daughter.
Little Domestic Goblin. This story happened to my family after we bought a new house. No one suspected that after moving, we would get a new neighbor in the form of a goblin. Living in a big city means traffic jams, fuss, polluted air, neighbors on the landing in the house, and the like. So one day at a family council, we decided that it was time to get our own home not far from the city, where we could spend weekends or live in the summer. Our choice fell on an old, but fairly well-preserved, well-kept, two-story house located in one of the villages of the city district. We liked that there was a large garden behind the house, a river flowed nearby, and our neighbors were a nice, quiet elderly couple. The man who sold it to us told us that this house was built by his father, who loved privacy and order. The very first night brought us an alarming surprise. My wife suddenly woke me up in the middle of the night and said that there was someone on the ceiling. She heard someone walking around and quietly muttering. I listened, but heard nothing. I said that it was probably the wind or mice. Calmed her down and we went to bed. The next day, we celebrated a housewarming party with guests and stayed up late. We decided to wash the dirty dishes in the morning. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, we heard the sound of broken dishes, and then a noise as if someone was sorting through them. We turned on the light and went into the kitchen. There was a broken plate on the floor, and it was clear that someone had touched the dishes. I assumed that there were probably rats or mice in the house, attracted by the remains of food. But the next night, an even stranger incident occurred. Our children were having a real laugh before going to bed. Toys and things were scattered all over their room, having made them promise to clean everything up in the morning. We put them to bed. Early in the morning, we were awakened by our daughter's scream. When we ran into the room, we saw the reason for it. It turned out that someone had tied her hair tightly to the bedpost. At first, I thought of my sister, but looking into her frightened eyes, I realized that it wasn't her. During the day, I told my elderly neighbor about all these strange cases. He just smiled in response. so it's probably a goblin playing pranks, he said. Returning to the house, I scrolled through the entire internet. There was no doubt it really looked like the tricks of a domestic goblin. Apparently, he didn't like our family, and as we know, all domestic goblins like order in the house, and we have dirty dishes, scattered toys. I read that if a goblin doesn't accept a family right away, then it is necessary to show him who is the boss in the house, and to do this, whip all the walls and corners with a whip, saying, "Know your place." In order not to be taken for a madman, I waited until all my family had left the house, then took the belt and performed the required ritual. By evening, the house was in perfect order. All night I listened to see if the goblin would somehow reveal himself, but everything went quietly, without incident. From then on, I made sure to keep the house tidy and clean every day, and the result was not long in coming. One morning, my daughter discovered that her hair was braided into a kind of plait. Thank God, I thought. Now I was an expert on domestic goblins, and I knew that a goblin braiding his hair was evidence that he liked us.
Scary card. This happened to me and my friend somewhere in the mid-90s, in one of the villages of the F.E.A.R region. Every summer I came there to rest from St. Petersburg, and my friend, his name was Anton from Moscow. One cloudy August day, we decided to go mushroom picking. The places there are quite remote. It is easy to get lost, so we decided to walk along the road through the forest, so that it would be visible from the forest. It should be added that cars or tractors drove along the road quite rarely. Since my village was the largest of all the surrounding villages, it was the only one with a store. People from other villages, located within a radius of 5 kilometers, went to ours for groceries. Some kept horses and went to the store on carts. For everyone, it was a completely ordinary means of transportation. Having barely left the village, I decided to immediately go into the forest. Anton continued walking along the road, quite rightly believing that it was necessary to go further away from the village to begin an active search. I walked through the forest, not losing sight of it. Having found nothing, I decided to join him. The forest was separated from the road by a small field about 50 meters wide. Coming out onto the field, I saw a cart coming towards Anton along the road, on which sat an old man and a small boy of about 8 or 10 years old. Their appearance immediately seemed strange to me. The boy was dressed in grey trousers and an old faded white loose shirt, and he had an old-fashioned cap on his head. The grandfather was sitting with his back to me, and I was not able to get a good look at him. The boy had the reins. I could not see his face. He was sitting half-turned to me. When the car drove up close enough to Anton, he suddenly stopped abruptly and dropped the basket from his hands. I quickened my pace and caught up with him a minute later. Anton was looking at the cart, moving away in a kind of stupor. I followed him and looked at the cart. It had already moved away about 20 or 30 meters, and suddenly the boy turned in our direction. What I saw literally made me go cold with horror. The boy's absolutely pale face had black holes instead of eyes. Since the cart was heading towards our village, we later cautiously asked our friends, had anyone seen this strange cart with an old man and a boy dressed in old-fashioned peasant clothes? But no one had seen anything like it or simply did not pay attention to the carts passing by.
Grandma's doll. When I was 9 years old, my father gave me a doll. The doll was beautiful and big, half my height. She had golden curly hair and blue eyes. She was wearing a beautiful white dress. When my father brought me the doll, he said that she had come from my grandmother, who had died a long time ago. The doll lay in a suitcase in the attic for several years. Then my father found it and brought it to me. I was very happy with this gift. At that age I liked to play with dolls. The first night, I put the doll next to me on the bed. I had a bad dream. I woke up and noticed that the doll's head was turned in my direction, and her eyes were looking at me. Having returned the doll's head to its normal position, I tried to fall asleep. After some time, opening my eyes, I was surprised to find that the doll's head was turned again, and her eyes were staring at me. I thought that maybe she was alive, a childish thought, but at the time it seemed really possible to me. I asked her, "Why are you looking at me?" Of course, she didn't answer. A few minutes later I fell asleep. The next day, when I woke up, I went to the bathroom to wash my face and found a small bruise on my left wrist. The bruise looked like a small handprint. I immediately thought about the doll, remembered how she looked at me at night. After washing, I returned to the room and went to the bed where the doll was lying. Her head was upright. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling. Then my father came in and told me to get dressed quickly, because we had to go to the hospital to see the dentist. After coming from the doctor, I spent the whole day with my neighbor, who was my best friend. In the evening before going to bed, I removed the doll from the bed and put her in the corner where my other two dolls were lying. I had another terrible dream, and it was about that new doll. When I woke up, I saw that the doll was lying next to me on the bed, turning its head and looking at me. I screamed in surprise. A few seconds later, my father came into my room and turned on the light. "What happened?" he asked. I answered that the doll that was lying in the corner was in my bed, and that scared me. My father smiled, came over and kissed me on the forehead. "Sleep tight," he said, "and I'll take the doll into the hall." I nodded and wiped my eyes, wet with tears. My father left, but I couldn't fall asleep. I tossed and turned on the bed for an hour, but then somehow fell asleep. Morning came. I got up, washed my face and went to the kitchen, but my father wasn't there. Strange, I thought. In the mornings, he always met me in the kitchen, making breakfast. I went to his room and opened the door. My father was lying on the floor next to the bed, all pale. It was as if I had been struck by electricity when I saw that he was lying there and not breathing. I ran up to him screaming, "Dad, Dad!" My father did not answer. Through my tears, I saw that the doll was sitting opposite his bed and looking at me. It seemed to me that she was smiling, or maybe it was not my imagination. Not remembering myself, I grabbed her by the hair, opened the window and threw her out into the street. Then I ran out into the hall, picked up the phone and started calling the ambulance. They arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. My father was dead. The doctors asked me about my relatives and called the local police officer. Later, when my relatives arrived and I came to my senses a little, I suddenly thought, what if someone picks up the doll and the same thing happens to their family as happened to me? I ran out into the street and went to the place under the window where I threw it, but I still couldn't find the doll. Many years have passed since then. I grew up, but I can't forget about that doll. Sometimes I dream about it. Then I wake up screaming and can't fall asleep for a long time.